My name is Olivia Jensen, and this is a story I never imagined myself telling. If someone had told me a year ago that I would one day be standing in the middle of the Arizona desert staring at a rundown gas station I spent my last penny on, I would have laughed. Or maybe I would have cried. Back then, all I had left was a stubborn sense of pride and a deep, aching desire to prove something to the people who had spent their entire lives doubting me. You see, I come from a family where success is measured in spreadsheets and stock options. The Jensens are known for their business empire back east, running a chain of pharmacies and grocery stores that have been in operation since before I was born. Everyone in my family knows their role. My younger brother Ethan, the lawyer with a golden resume and an even shinier future. My sister Rachel, the lifestyle influencer with hundreds of thousands of followers and a condo overlooking Central Park. And then there's me, the disappointment. They never said it out loud, but it was always there. In the forced smiles during family dinners, in the side comments during holiday parties, in the way my father's voice tightened every time I spoke about chasing stories instead of chasing promotions. I was the only one who walked away from the family business. I had dreams of becoming an investigative journalist, of uncovering the truth and telling stories that mattered. But dreams are expensive, and truth rarely pays the bills. So when I spent all the money I had left on a forgotten gas station in the middle of nowhere, even I questioned my sanity. And when I told my family about it, the silence that followed was louder than any insult. My father laughed. My mother looked away. Rachel texted a laughing emoji. Ethan said nothing at all. They thought it was another one of my reckless, pointless stunts. But what they didn't know was that buried beneath that dusty roof, under layers of rust and regret, was something that would change everything. I just hadn't discovered it yet. I was born in Manhattan, raised in a tall glass tower with a doorman and a skyline view. My childhood was scripted in privilege. Private schools weekend, getaways to the Hamptons, and a family name that opened every door. The Jensen family was everything people envied from the outside. My father, Leonard Jensen, is a titan of the retail world. He built his chain of pharmacies and grocery outlets from the ground up, starting with a single corner store in Brooklyn and turning it into a regional powerhouse. My mother, Elise, was the perfect executive wife, always polished, always supportive in public, and perfectly calculating in private. To the world, we were a picture of success. To me, it always felt like a carefully curated performance. I never fit into their mold. While my siblings memorized business terms and interned at family subsidiaries during summer breaks, I stayed up late reading biographies of whistleblowers and investigative journalists. I wasn't interested in market shares. I was obsessed with truth. While Ethan studied law at Columbia and Rachel built her brand on beauty tips and travel vlogs, I took a scholarship to a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, majoring in journalism. They called it a phase. I called it freedom. But freedom came with a cost. After graduation, I worked for a digital news site that specialized in long-form investigations. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was terrible, the hours brutal. But for the first time in my life, I felt alive. I chased down corrupt housing deals, sat through endless court hearings, even got threatened once by a real estate developer who didn't appreciate my digging. And then came the story that ruined everything. I was deep into a months-long investigation into a pharmaceutical company accused of bribing doctors to push dangerous prescriptions. I had sources, I had documents, I had everything. But when we published the first piece, the company's lawyers came down like a storm. Our site received cease and desist letters, and our management folded like a cheap chair. My editor, who once praised me for my persistence, asked me to back off. When I refused, they cut me loose. Just like that. No severance, no fanfare. Just a locked account and a final email thanking me for my service. I moved out of my apartment, sold my car, and crawled back to New York with my tail between my legs. My family greeted me with the kind of awkward pity reserved for failed experiments. At one family dinner, my father asked if I was finally ready to get serious with life. I bit my tongue and smiled. My mother offered to get me in touch with a friend at a lifestyle magazine, as if a fluff piece on interior design would soothe the fire burning in me. Rachel rolled her eyes and whispered to Ethan, "She's going to write about vegan wine next." It hurt. Every word stung. But what hurt more was the way they believed they were right. that I was just a stubborn idealist who couldn't survive in the real world. And maybe they weren't entirely wrong. I started freelancing, but the gigs were rare and unpaid. I created a podcast hoping to rebuild my voice, but it never reached beyond a few hundred plays. My savings vanished, my pride eroded. The city that once inspired me now suffocated me. That's when I left New York. I packed what little I had and took a train west. Arizona wasn't planned. I had no job, no connections, just a vague hope that if I got far enough away, I might hear my own thoughts again. I found a room to rent in a small desert town called Marlow, population under 3,000, where the air was dry and the sky stretched forever. I worked part-time at a library, wrote late into the night, and walked under the stars every evening, wondering if this was it. If this was the quiet end of a loud dream, but something inside me still stirred. I couldn't let it go. I wasn't ready to fold. I wanted to prove that I could do something on my own without my family name, without anyone's approval. I just didn't know what. Not yet. In Marlow, every day felt like a repeat of the last. I woke up to the dry desert sun, shelved books for a few hours at the library, and then spent my evenings scribbling in notebooks or staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had come apart so quickly. I applied for jobs in journalism marketing, even customer service roles at local hotels, but nothing landed. My resume, once a source of pride, now felt like a reminder of all the doors that had closed. The few interviews I managed to get usually ended with some version of the same line. You're overqualified. Or worse, you're not what we're looking for. I started to wonder if maybe my family had been right all along. I wasn't cut out for business, not wired for long-term planning or financial discipline. I was impulsive, driven by emotion, always chasing something intangible. That's what my father said once during a Christmas dinner, not knowing I'd overheard. She's not grounded. She wants to save the world, but she can't even save herself. I carried those words with me like stones in my pocket. Every failure added weight. I tried launching a newsletter focused on local corruption, hoping to revive some spark of my past, but no one subscribed. I bought an old used camera to start a documentary vlog about small-town America, but after 3 videos and 42 views, I gave up. I volunteered for a nonprofit that helped migrant families, thinking maybe I could find purpose there, but the bureaucracy drained me. Nothing fit, nothing stuck. And all the while, my savings trickled down to zero. I sold my laptop for a fraction of what it was worth, canceled every streaming subscription, started living off instant noodles and dollar store groceries. One afternoon, I got a birthday invitation from Rachel. She was throwing herself a lavish party in Miami, complete with a yacht brunch and a luxury skincare pop-up. The card was pink with gold lettering, her smiling face printed across the front. I didn't RSVP, but I did scroll through the photos she posted afterward. I saw Ethan in a linen suit laughing with a glass of champagne, my parents smiling in a group shot, and me not there, not mentioned, not missed. I thought about how easy it would be to just give in. To call my father, ask for a job in one of his stores, admit defeat. He'd give it to me. He'd even sound generous while doing it, but I couldn't bring myself to make that call. I didn't want pity. I wanted respect. I wanted to look in the mirror and see someone who hadn't surrendered. One evening after a particularly brutal rejection email, I sat on the library's back steps watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in oranges and reds. A part of me whispered that maybe this was all there was. Maybe not everyone gets to make something of themselves. Maybe some of us just drift and try to find peace with it. But then I thought of that little girl I used to be, who used to read stories of courage and rebellion under the covers with a flashlight. She wouldn't accept this. She'd get up. She'd try again. I just needed one chance, one idea, one spark to light the next fire. I didn't know it yet, but that spark was just around the corner. It would come from a voice I hadn't heard in years, a name I barely remembered, and a phone call that would change everything. It was a Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. These days, most unexpected calls were either spam or disappointment. But something made me swipe the screen. The voice on the other end was gruff, familiar in a way that stirred up old memories. Olivia Jensen said the voice still chasing ghosts. I blinked. Roy Calhoun had been one of my earliest mentors during my brief career in journalism. He was older, cynical, a chain smoker with a sharp eye for corruption and an even sharper sense of self-preservation. He had walked away from journalism years before I was fired, citing burnout and lawsuits. Last I heard, he had moved to Arizona to dabble in real estate. I laughed weakly, didn't expect to hear from you. I figured you were retired or hiding from a scandal. He chuckled, same old Liv, still full of fire. Listen, I've got something you might want to look at. It's not a story, not exactly. It's an opportunity. That word always came with a price. I asked what kind of opportunity. Roy launched into a pitch. There's this property just outside of Marlow off Route 85. Old gas station boarded up for years. It's ugly forgotten, basically a carcass. But, and here's the kicker, I got wind of a new infrastructure project. State's planning to build a commercial corridor from the border up to Phoenix. This spot might be right in the path. He said the property was listed at $15,000 a steal. I laughed. That's still $15,000 more than I have. He paused, then said he could get it held for me. Just think about it. You want to build something. Here's a chance. I'll even help with paperwork. He hung up before I could say no. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the cracked ceiling of my rented room, Roy's words echoing in my mind. It's ugly. It's forgotten. It might be in the path. Every rational part of me said this was absurd. I wasn't a businesswoman. I didn't know anything about real estate. I had no capital, no plan, no backup. But another part of me, the part that remembered how it felt to be right before everyone said I was wrong, couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I took the bus out to see the property. The place looked worse than I imagined. Desert dropped the rusted sign read hanging crooked on a faded pole. The gas pumps were gutted, the windows broken, the roof sagging like a tired old man. Sand had crept inside the convenience store, and the smell of oil and something rotting lingered in the air. It was a wreck, a total disaster, and for some reason I felt something stir inside me. Maybe it was the emptiness. Maybe it was the challenge. Maybe it was just desperation wrapped in pride. I called Roy. I said I'd take it. I borrowed money from the last person who still believed in me, an old college friend named Mara, who wired me $5,000 without asking for details. I sold everything I could, including my camera and the last valuable ring I had from my mother's jewelry box. Roy helped expedite the process. He said the seller was eager. Within a week, I signed the papers, handed over the money, and got the keys. I stood in front of Desert Drop as the sun dipped below the horizon, holding a ring of rusted keys in my hand, and felt a strange mix of triumph and terror. I had no idea what I was doing, but it was mine. When I told my family in a group message, the responses were exactly what I expected. My father replied with a single word, Olivia. My mother didn't respond. Rachel sent back a laughing emoji followed by a gif of a gas station explosion from an action movie. Ethan said, I hope you have insurance. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Let them laugh. Let them roll their eyes. This was my grave to dig, or my mountain to climb. I wasn't sure which yet. The first morning I stepped into Desert Drop as its owner, I felt like I had wandered into a time capsule sealed with rot. The air inside was thick with the stench of mildew, gasoline, and something else I couldn't place. The walls were cracked, the tiles chipped and curling, and a family of mice had made a home behind the rusted refrigerator unit. I tried to open the back office door, but the knob broke off in my hand. I stood there covered in dust and regret, wondering what the hell I had done. I spent the next few days trying to clean. I didn't have money for professional help, so I did it myself. I bought cheap gloves, a mop, and a few buckets of cleaner from a local discount store. The cashier looked at me like I was mad when I mentioned I was fixing up the old gas station. The second night it rained. I found out quickly that the roof leaked in 6 different places. I had to place buckets around the floor to catch the water, and even then it wasn't enough. I slept on a fold-out cot in the back room, wrapped in a sleeping bag, listening to the drip, drip, drip of water hitting metal. On the third day, I drove into town to get a few more supplies. I stopped by the realty office that handled the property, hoping to ask about the history of the place, maybe see if there were any old records. The secretary there was polite curious, even when she asked how I'd found the place. I mentioned Roy's name. Her expression shifted. Roy Calhoun. Yeah, he pushed that place on a few folks before. Most of them walked away after the inspection reports came back. I frowned. What do you mean? She looked around, lowered her voice. The property was listed for $2,500 3 months ago, but it got pulled. Something about an inside deal. That's when my stomach dropped. $2,500 I had paid $15,000. I asked her to check the public listing history. She pulled up the records. Sure enough, it had been listed pulled, then relisted under a different shell company. The seller was a group Roy was tied to. It was all right there. He had flipped the property on paper, marked it up 6 times the value, and pocketed the difference. I drove back to Desert Drop in silence. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight they ached. I called Roy 3 times. No answer. The 4th call went straight to voicemail. I left a message. You knew I didn't have money. You knew what this place was. You used me. I didn't expect a reply, and I never got one. That night, I sat in the back office with the broken doorknob in my lap. I stared at the cracked floor, at the walls that seemed to close in tighter with every breath, and I felt something inside me collapse. Not just the betrayal, not just the money. It was the weight of knowing I had bet everything on a lie. I could have gone home. I could have called my father and told him he was right, that I had been scammed, that I was broke, that I had no plan. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because if I did, I would never forgive myself. I had nothing left but this place, this ruin in the desert, and if it was going to be my ruin, then I would go down with it on my own terms. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The day I found it, the air was still and dry, the kind of desert silence that presses into your ears until you start to hear your own thoughts a little too loudly. I was working on the plumbing. The water pressure in the back sink had been inconsistent, and every time I turned the faucet, it sputtered and coughed like it was choking on dust. I figured a pipe was either clogged or cracked somewhere beneath the floor. I had no real experience with plumbing, but YouTube videos had become my reluctant teachers. I moved a few crates, pulled up a couple of warped floorboards, and began to dig, hoping to find the source of the problem. I expected dirt rocks, maybe rusted pipe fragments. What I did not expect was the hollow sound of metal scraping against old wood. It stopped me cold. I tapped again, lighter this time. The sound was distinct, a dull thud beneath the packed earth. I brushed away the dust and saw what looked like the edge of a wooden panel. My heart picked up speed. I grabbed a crowbar and pried at the edges. The wood groaned and splintered reluctant after what must have been decades of silence. Finally, with a crack, the panel lifted free, revealing a dark square hole beneath. I sat back on my heels, staring. The opening was just wide enough for a person to climb through. A staircase led down into shadow, narrow and steep. I should have hesitated. I should have called someone. But curiosity pushed aside reason. I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped onto the top stair. The wood creaked under my weight, but held. I descended slowly, one hand gripping the rail, my breath held tight in my chest. The air grew cooler as I moved downward, the scent changing from dust to something deeper, earthy aged with a faint sweetness. At the bottom, I found myself in a cellar no bigger than a small studio apartment. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, some collapsing, others still sturdy, and on those shelves sat bottles, hundreds of them, each one dusty, some wrapped in cloth. Others exposed, their labels faded but still legible under the beam of my phone's light. I walked closer, wiping one label clean. The script was old-fashioned elegant, Chateau Margaux. Another read, Domaine de la Romanée Conti. A third, Chateau Lafite Rothschild. I wasn't a wine expert, but even I knew these names. These weren't just bottles, they were artifacts. I found crates in the corners sealed with wax and marked with dates from the 1920s. My breath caught. Prohibition. This place had been a smuggler's stash. During the years alcohol was banned in the U.S., bootleggers had stored wine and spirits in hidden places just like this. Desert Drop hadn't just been a gas station, it had been a front. I sat down on the cool floor phone, still in hand, staring at the treasure around me. It felt unreal, like stumbling into a forgotten chapter of American history. And it was mine. I didn't sleep that night. I took 3 bottles back to my room, placed them gently on the floor, and spent hours researching. Every article, every wine database, every auction record I could find. The numbers were staggering. A single bottle of Chateau Margaux 1921 had once sold for over $100,000. Domaine de la Romanée-Conti from the same era, even more. I felt dizzy. If the collection was authentic and well preserved, I was sitting on a fortune, but also a responsibility. This wasn't just about money, it was about a story, a legacy buried and forgotten in the desert, and I had found it. The next morning, I contacted a wine appraiser in Tucson. I told him I had inherited a few bottles and wanted to know their value. I didn't mention the seller. Not yet. He agreed to meet. I carefully packed 3 bottles into a wooden box I had cleaned and padded with towels. The drive to Tucson felt longer than it should have. Every bump in the road made me wince. Every turn made me glance at the box to make sure nothing had shifted. When I arrived, the appraiser, a man named Henry Caldwell, greeted me with a firm handshake and a curious look. He examined each bottle under specialized lights, checked the corks, the sediment, the labels. His silence made my skin crawl. Finally, he looked up, removed his glasses, and said, "Miss Jensen, I don't know where you got these, but they are real. And if the rest of your collection looks anything like this, you're in possession of a historical gold mine." I asked him what he meant by gold mine. He smiled. These 3 bottles alone could fetch nearly $500,000 at auction. Multiply that by hundreds and you're looking at millions. I left the building in a daze, clutching the box like it contained the last hope on earth. Back in Marlow, I returned to the cellar and began cataloging. I wrote down every legible label, took photos, sealed the place with a new lock, and installed a makeshift alarm using an old motion sensor kit I found online. It wasn't professional security, but it was something. I wasn't going to let this slip away. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like a guardian of something rare. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I had crossed a threshold. Desert Drop was no longer a symbol of my mistakes. It was the start of everything. The days that followed were a blur of motion and adrenaline. I couldn't stop thinking about what Henry had said, how casually he had tossed around words like millions and historical. But I knew better than to get carried away. I needed verification documentation and, above all, a plan. I called Henry the next morning and asked if he'd be willing to come out to Marlow. I didn't want to keep carrying the bottles back and forth, and more importantly, I didn't want to leave the stash unattended. To my surprise, he agreed. He arrived 2 days later in a silver SUV, stepping out in desert boots and a crisp white shirt that already looked too clean for the dust he was about to walk through. I took him straight to the cellar. When I opened the trap door and the wooden stairs came into view, he looked at me with a raised eyebrow. I just nodded. "You'll want to see this for yourself." He followed me down slowly, his flashlight sweeping across the space like a spotlight on a forgotten stage. When he reached the bottom, he froze. I could hear his breath catch in the silence. "My God," he whispered. I watched him move through the room like a man walking through a cathedral. He didn't speak for a long time, just examined labels, traced his fingers along the dusty crates, and crouched to read dates carved into the wood. Finally, he stood and looked at me with a seriousness that settled deep into my bones. "Miss Jensen, what you have here is not just valuable. It's historic. This collection, assuming the condition holds, could be one of the most significant Prohibition-era wine discoveries in the continental United States." I asked him what came next. He explained that before anything could be sold, we'd need appraisals, preservation measures insurance, and then careful planning for auction. The whole process could take months, maybe longer, but if done right, it could change my life. I felt the weight of that sentence. Not just the money, but the validation, the chance to prove everyone wrong. I asked him to help me to manage the process. He agreed with one condition: full discretion. The last thing either of us wanted was a media circus or a stampede of opportunists. Over the next 3 weeks, we worked quietly. Henry brought in a small team of trusted experts to catalog and assess the collection. They set up a temporary lab inside the convenience store, converting the old counter space into a makeshift office lined with laptops, lights, and glass testing equipment. Every day, more pieces of the puzzle came into focus. Some of the bottles had wax seals that matched known bootlegging syndicates. Others bore private markings initials etched into the glass, possibly code names for distributors or smugglers. One crate was filled with bottles marked "not for sale." We theorized it might have been a personal reserve for someone high in the chain. Meanwhile, I stayed busy reinforcing the building. I patched the roof with help from a local contractor, installed better locks, and paid a retired vet named Gary to keep an eye on the property when I had to run errands. He was quiet, reliable, and never asked questions. When we finally selected 10 bottles to be sold at a closed-door auction in Las Vegas, I could barely sleep. Henry handled the logistics, renting a suite at a luxury hotel, inviting only vetted collectors and historians. I wore my best thrift store blazer, trying to look composed as we unveiled the bottles under glass cases. The room buzzed with interest. A few guests whispered in awe, others simply stared. When the bidding began, my heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the numbers. The first bottle sold for $130,000. The second, $155,000. By the end of the evening, all 10 bottles had sold. The final total was just under $1.2 million. I signed the documents with a shaking hand, tears threatening to spill. Not because of the money, though, that was overwhelming enough, but because for the first time in years, I had built something. I had taken failure abandonment in a broken building in the middle of nowhere and turned it into something extraordinary. When I walked out of that hotel ballroom, the lights of the Strip blurred in my vision. I didn't call my family. I didn't need to, because I knew the news would reach them soon enough. And when it did, they'd finally understand. It didn't take long for the news to travel. A few days after the auction, a niche collector's blog posted a vague article titled "Woman Discovers Hidden Wine Cellar Worth Millions Under Abandoned Arizona Gas Station." They didn't mention my name, but it didn't matter. The story made its way to wine forums, real estate blogs, even a couple of low-level financial sites. From there, it spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, my phone was vibrating every few hours with messages, emails, and missed calls. Some were reporters, others were strangers pretending to be distant relatives or potential partners. But the calls that struck me most came from home. My mother called first. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before answering. Her voice was soft, a little too sweet. "Olivia, I just saw something online. Is it true? Is it really worth that much?" I said yes. There was a pause, and then she said, "Your father thinks we should talk. This is bigger than you realize. You need structure guidance support." She used all the right words, but I knew what she meant. Control, leverage, ownership. I told her I was fine, that I had professionals helping me, that I didn't need Shepherd and Jensen Retail Holdings involved in a wine operation in the middle of the desert. She sighed. "Don't be defensive, sweetheart. We're family. Families help each other." I hung up before I could say something I'd regret. A few hours later, Ethan sent an email. It was written like a legal memo full of bullet points and jargon. He offered to oversee any future contracts or expansion deals and closed by saying he could draw up a licensing agreement that would protect my assets. I didn't reply. Rachel texted the next day. "Heard about the wine thing. Wild. If you want help making the place look more luxe, I know decorators." I told her no thanks. Then she sent a photo of a Pinterest mood board anyway. I deleted it. It all came so fast, so neatly wrapped in smiles and fake concern. The same people who had laughed at me for years were now tripping over themselves to get close. And I hated how much it still hurt. Not their offers I didn't want their help, but the realization that their respect came only after money did. Not when I was scraping floors or sleeping in a leaking shack. Not when I was cleaning mouse droppings off the shelves. Only now. I sat in the front of the store that night, lights low, staring at a dusty bottle I hadn't cataloged yet. It was still sealed the wax dark and cracked at the edge. I thought about calling them back just to scream, to tell them where they were when I needed $1 or a kind word, but I didn't. I just sat there holding the bottle and reminded myself that this silence, this moment was mine, not theirs. The money from the auction didn't change me overnight, but it did change what was possible. The first thing I did was pay Mara back with interest, wiring her a sum that made her call me crying and laughing at the same time. Then I cleared every debt I had, closed out old credit cards, and finally exhaled the years of pressure that had been sitting like a stone on my chest. With the remaining funds, I began transforming Desert Drop into something more than a memory of failure. I renamed it the Oasis, not because it was clever, but because it felt true. It had become a refuge for me, and now I wanted it to be a place that held meaning for others. I hired local contractors to restore the building's facade, keeping the bones intact while reinforcing everything that time had worn down. The convenience store was converted into a gallery space displaying select bottles under glass with placards telling the history of Prohibition and the underground wine trade. I collaborated with a local historian to write short narratives for each display, piecing together stories from clues found in the seller initials on crates, dates burned into corks, faded shipping manifests that had somehow survived in a sealed tin box. I installed new lighting, polished the floors, added soft jazz to play through hidden speakers. It wasn't just a store anymore. It was an experience, a journey into the past, and people came. Slowly at first, locals, curious travelers, wine hobbyists. Then the word spread further. I partnered with a boutique tour company that ran historical excursions across Arizona. The Oasis became a featured stop. Guests walked through the cellar on guided tours, tasted preserved vintage blends in the lounge, and listened to the story of how a forgotten gas station held secrets buried for nearly a century. I didn't glamorize my journey. In fact, I told it plainly. I let people see the before photos, the documents of the original property sale, even the emails Roy had stopped responding to. I wanted the full story to live in the walls, not just the shiny ending. Tourists bought postcards with old gas station prints and little bottles of infused desert honey I stocked from a nearby apiary. A local artist painted a mural on the side wall showing a woman descending into a dark cellar holding a lantern, the shelves of bottles glowing like jewels behind her. We called it the Discovery, and every time I passed it I felt seen. When another auction was held 4 months later, I sold 15 more bottles carefully selected with the help of Henry and his team. The total earnings exceeded $4 million. I reinvested most of it, bought the surrounding land parcels, updated the parking area, and added a small wine bar at the back of the property that served artisan small plates and vintage tastings. I called it Dust and Vine. It became popular with local food critics and a weekend getaway spot for people from Phoenix and Tucson. My name started appearing in magazine blurbs and online profiles. People wanted to write about the woman who turned a dying gas station into a cultural landmark. I gave interviews cautious but proud, making sure to always circle back to the heart of it. What had been forgotten was now remembered, and what had been dismissed had found value. I created a scholarship for young investigative journalists in rural communities and named it after Roy. As much as he had betrayed me, he had also unknowingly set me on this path. I wanted that contradiction to live in the legacy. My father didn't call again. Neither did Ethan. My mother sent a Christmas card that year addressed simply to the Oasis. Inside, she wrote, "I hope you are well." I displayed it on the counter next to the register where guests checked in for tours. Rachel posted a story once from the wine bar tagging me with the caption, "From ruin to riches." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The Oasis had become more than a business. It was proof that even in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but grit and a foolish amount of hope, something beautiful could grow. I no longer woke up afraid. I no longer stared at the ceiling wondering if I was worth the oxygen I was taking up. I had built something that mattered, and I wasn't done yet. Sometimes when the sun dips behind the mountains and the desert turns that soft pink hue, I sit outside the oasis with a glass of water or maybe a small pour of something old and rare, and I watch the sky. I think about that first night I stood here staring at a broken building with broken dreams, wondering if I'd just made the worst mistake of my life. I think about how close I came to giving up. How many nights I cried in silence, too ashamed to tell anyone how lost I felt. And I think about the cellar dark and patient beneath my feet all that time, holding on to its secret, waiting for someone stubborn or foolish enough to find it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that value doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hides, And sometimes the thing that looks worthless on the outside is the very thing that saves you. My family still doesn't really get it. They see the success Now the Magazine features and growing revenue, but they'll never understand what it cost to build something from the bones of failure. And that's okay. I'm not building this for them. I'm building it for the girl I used to be. The one who believed stories mattered, who stayed up late writing when the world told her to go to bed and be quiet. I'm building it for anyone who's ever been dismissed, laughed at, underestimated, or told to give up. Because here's the truth. Sometimes life breaks you down not to bury you, but to plant you. Sometimes the collapse is the beginning, not the end. And if you listen closely, if you stay still long enough, you might hear the ground whisper back, "Dig here. Try again." I was the girl who spent her last dollar on a gas station in the desert, and everyone thought I was crazy, until I wasn't. Until the ground opened up and gave me back something more valuable than I ever imagined. Not just the wine, not just the money, but proof that I was never the failure they believed. I was just waiting to be found. So if you're out there sitting in your own broken place wondering if any of it matters, this is for you. Keep digging. You never know what's waiting beneath the floor.